The peace concluded following the results of the last Italian war did not last long. The fact is that the aged Emperor Maximilian I wanted his relative, the Spanish King Charles I, to become the new Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire after his death. In turn, the French King Francis I proposed a more worthy, in his opinion, candidate for the role of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, namely himself. Maximilian I died in 1519, after which the struggle for the throne of the Holy Roman Emperor began almost immediately. The electors who were to elect a new emperor were enterprising people and promised their support to two candidates at once. Knowing perfectly well that the electors would not vote for free even before his death, Maximilian promised each of them 500,000 florins for voting for the right candidate. The French king raised the stakes, promising each of them 3 million florins. In turn, Charles I, realizing that the crown of the Holy Roman Empire could go to his rival, got into debt, but still he was able to promise the electors more money than the French king. The electors were already thinking about how they would spend the promised money, but at that time Charles I led his army to the vicinity of Frankfurt, where the emperor was elected. Having estimated the size of the army of Charles I, the electors, of course, voted for him. Whether they eventually received the promised money or made their choice guided only by their sudden respect for the will of the deceased Emperor Maximilian I is unknown, but Charles V was proclaimed the new emperor on October 23, 1520. Thus, under his rule, in addition to Spain and the Neapolitan Kingdom, was the Holy Roman Empire and the Burgundian Netherlands. Relations between Charles V and Francis I began to deteriorate rapidly, which made it obvious to everyone that war was inevitable. The English King Henry VIII decided to intervene in the dispute between the two monarchs, who acted as a peacemaker dreaming of strengthening his influence on the European continent. Of course, the English king failed to reconcile Charles V and Francis I, so he promised that he would start a war against one of the monarchs who would be the first to break the peace. The threats of the English king naturally could not force Francis I to abandon his plans for the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. But since the French king did not want to wage war with two opponents at the same time, he decided to act by cunning. In June 1520, on the orders of the French king, the army under the command of Robert III de la Marche launched an attack on the Burgundian Netherlands, and the army of Henry II of Navarre attacked Navarre. Both attacks did not bring the desired result and were repulsed. On October 22, 1521, Charles V decided to strike back, but his army was confronted by a numerically superior French force near Valenciennes. Fortunately for Charles V, Francis did not dare to immediately attack the imperial army, thanks to which he was able to successfully retreat. When the French troops were ready to pursue the enemy, heavy rains began, which forced Francis to abandon this idea. After an unsuccessful attack by the army of the Holy Roman Empire, the French began active operations. The army under the command of Claude de Guise, as a result of a swift attack, occupied the city of Fuenterrabia, located on the Franco-Spanish border, and organized a bridgehead that allowed the offensive to develop deep into Spain. At this time, the anti-French coalition managed to gather a 23,000-strong army near the city of Bologna, which was led by the Italian condottiere Prospero Colonna. Having learned about the preparations of the enemy, the French governor in Milan, Lautrec, hastily hired a detachment of 12,000 Swiss mercenaries to resist the invasion. The Allied army crossed the border of the Duchy of Milan and laid siege to the city of Parma. At this time, Lautrec, having gathered his strength and received reinforcements from the Venetians, advanced to meet the enemy. For unknown reasons, he did not dare to attack the Allied army besieging Parma, but instead stopped on the banks of the Po River. Very soon, Lautrec ran out of money, and since the Swiss were not ready to fight for free, they left his army. Having lost half of his army due to lack of money, Lautrec was forced to hastily retreat to Milan. By this time, the Allied army had occupied Parma and began pursuing Lautrec's army. Realizing that the available forces were not enough to defend Milan, Lautrec left the city and retreated to the north of the Duchy of Milan. 13,000 Swiss pikemen hired by Francis I arrived to help Lautrec, thanks to which he had the strength to confront the Allied army. The problem was that Lautrec did not have the money to pay for the services of mercenaries, so he agreed to the Swiss proposal to immediately attack the Allied army and plunder their camp. The battle began on April 27, 1522. The attack on the well-fortified Allied camp was unsuccessful, and the French suffered a crushing defeat. After the defeat of the French troops, the Swiss mercenaries returned to their homeland and Lautrec found himself practically without an army. In this situation, he was forced to retreat to France, and the Allied troops, having captured the entire Duchy of Milan, began the siege of the city of Genoa. The siege of the city was short, and on May 30th, Genoa fell into the hands of the Allies. In October 1523, a French army of 18,000 soldiers under the command of Guillaume Gouffier de Bonnevat set out on a campaign. Having reached the city of Novara, the French army united with an army of Swiss mercenaries numbering about 18,000 soldiers. Having learned about the invasion of the French, Prospero Colonna, under whose command there were no more than 9,000 soldiers, took up defense in Milan. In turn, Gouffier de Bonnevat thought that the imperial army in the Duchy of Milan was more numerous, so he decided not to storm Milan and settled for winter quarters. On December 28, Prospero Colonna dies and Charles de Lannoy becomes the new commander. By this time, the Milan garrison received impressive reinforcements in the form of 15,000 Landsknechts, as well as troops under the command of Charles de Bourbon, who, due to financial disputes with Francis I, went over to the side of the Imperials. The situation for the French worsened as Gouffier de Bonnevat began to run out of money and the Swiss mercenaries abandoned his army. Having lost his numerical advantage, de Bonnevat began to retreat, and the imperial army began to pursue him. The battle took place on the banks of the Seja River. The French suffered a crushing defeat and retreated into the depths of France. Taking advantage of this, Fernando d'Avalos, at the head of an 11,000-strong army, crossed the Alps and invaded Provence. Encountering no serious resistance, he occupies the capital of the Aix-en-Provence region and proclaims himself Count of Provence. The only city of Provence left under French control was Marseille. The army of d'Avalos laid siege to Marseille in mid-August. Despite attempts to take the city by storm, it was not possible. Already at the end of September, a 40,000-strong French army arrived in Avignon, which was personally commanded by Francis I, so the imperial troops had to hastily leave Provence in the face of a numerically superior enemy. In October 1524, the army of Francis I crosses the Alps and begins to move towards Milan. Upon learning of the approach of the French army, the commander of the garrison of Milan leaves the city and retreats to Lodi. Thus, on October 26, the French occupied Milan unopposed. After occupying the capital of the Duchy of Milan, Francis, at the head of his army, advanced towards the city of Pavia, which was guarded by a large imperial garrison. In November, the French army reached the outskirts of Pavia and, blockading the city, made several assault attempts. Since the assault attempts were unsuccessful, and the French were running out of gunpowder, they decided to wait until the defenders of the city ran out of supplies or money to pay for the services of mercenaries. In January 1525, the commander of the imperial troops in the region, Charles de Lannoy, received reinforcements in the form of 15,000 Landsknechts, which allowed him to begin active operations. He cut communications between Milan and Pavia, and on February 2 his army reached the outskirts of Pavia. At this point, the opponents possessed the following forces. Under the command of Francis I, there were 7,000 Swiss mercenaries, 4,000 Landsknechts from the Black Gang, 4,000 French infantry and 2,000 Italian infantry, as well as 2,000 light horsemen and 4,000 heavily armed horsemen. The imperial army consisted of 12,000 Landsknechts, 5,000 Spanish infantry and 3,000 Italian infantry. She also had 1,500 light horsemen and about 1,200 heavy horsemen at her disposal. The Pavia garrison consisted of 7,000 Landsknechts and 3,000 Spanish infantry. The French army was positioned around the besieged city, but most of it was in the walled, wooded Mirabello Park. The imperial troops set up their camp 100 meters from the wall of Mirabello Park. Knowing that most of the imperial army consisted of mercenaries, Francis I decides to take up defense and simply wait until the enemy runs out of money to pay for the services of mercenaries. The financial situation of the Imperials was indeed deplorable. The fact is that the mercenaries who were in Pavia had not received a salary for a long time and therefore could rebel and surrender the city to the French. To exclude such a scenario, the imperial command decided to break through to Pavia in order to transport a convoy with money, provisions and gunpowder to the city. According to the plan drawn up, the commandant of Pavia, on a signal in the form of 3 blank cannon shots, was to make a sortie and support the attack of the main imperial army. On the night of February 24, the imperial units advanced to the hunting park and began to destroy a section of the wall near the gates of Porta Pescarina. In order not to attract attention, gunpowder could not be used, so the destruction of the wall progressed rather slowly. To distract the French troops, a small detachment of Imperials deployed artillery at the gates of the Tor del Gallo and began to fire on the French. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, a detachment of French horsemen found the Imperials destroying the wall, but it was too late. Imperial infantry, cavalry and artillery had already entered the park. The French cavalry did not dare to attack the superior forces of the enemy, but instead sent a message to the Swiss troops and also to the king. A rather thick fog descended on the park. It was at this moment that the battle began. The French cavalry clashed with the light horsemen of the Imperials, who were advancing from the north. At the same moment, the Swiss who came to the rescue entered the battle and, pushing back the Imperials, captured an artillery battery. The Swiss could not use the captured guns because there were no artillerymen among them. At about 6 a.m., the Pavia garrison, having received a signal, began to climb out. Moving out of the city, he cut off the French detachments located east of Pavia from the main army. At this time, the imperial arquebusiers reached the vicinity of the hunting palace and captured the convoy of the French army. At about 7 o'clock in the morning, Imperial Landsknechts entered the park, who immediately entered into battle with the Swiss who had occupied an artillery battery. Because of the hatred that the Landsknechts and the Swiss had for each other, the battle was very fierce. In the midst of the battle, Francis arrived on the battlefield at the head of his gendarmes. From the very beginning, they attacked the Imperial Knights and, due to their numerical superiority, overturned them rather quickly. The Imperial Knights hurriedly retreated into the forest, but the French did not want to pursue them, remaining in the clearing. The position of the gendarmes was the most disadvantageous. They were constrained by bushes and could not maneuver due to the rugged terrain. In addition, the French cavalry blocked their artillery fire zone. While Francis was thinking about how to proceed, arquebusiers advanced towards the gendarmes. In addition, the Imperials withdrew some of the Landsknechts from the battle and sent them to attack the gendarmes. Very soon, the French gendarmes found themselves in a very difficult situation. They came under heavy fire from the arquebusiers, and the Landsknecht attack did not allow them to maneuver. The gendarmes tried to resist, but after a while they were completely destroyed, and the king himself was captured. At this time, Landsknechts from the Black Band tried to save the king, but they were too late and were attacked by superior forces of the Imperial Landsknechts. Since the Landsknechts from the Black Band were considered traitors by the Imperial Landsknechts and hated more than the Swiss, as a result of a bloody battle, the Landsknechts from the Black Band were almost completely destroyed. By this point, the Swiss, who were fighting alongside the captured battery under pressure from a numerically superior enemy, faltered and began a retreat, which turned into a rout. The second detachment of the Swiss fought with the garrison of Pavia, but seeing the fleeing comrades, he also faltered. The Swiss tried to swim across the river, but most of them died. The rearguard of the French under the command of the Duke of Alencon, having learned about the defeat of the main army, left the vicinity of Pavia without entering into battle. In this battle, the French lost from 10 to 12,000 soldiers, while the losses of the Imperials amounted to no more than 500 soldiers. Already on March 3, almost without resistance, the Imperial troops occupied Milan. Francis I was taken prisoner by Charles V. On January 14, 1526, he was forced to sign the Treaty of Madrid, according to which France renounced claims to Italy, and also transferred Burgundy, Flanders and Artois to Charles V. In addition, Francis promised to send his 2 sons to Spain as hostages. Returning to France, Francis was not eager to fulfill the terms of the peace treaty, and Pope Clement VII, who did not like the strengthening of the Spaniards in Italy, allowed him not to fulfill his obligations, since the treaty was signed under pressure. Thus a new war between Francis I and Charles V was inevitable. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Let's explore history together.